What's going on, everyone? Brian Matiash here. So this video is all about looking back, looking inward as a photographer. So the past few months I've been working on a new project. I'm very excited to talk a little bit more about it next week. But as I've kind of gotten older, I turned 40 in September of 2018. I've learned and appreciated introspection, looking in, specifically looking to my past, the kind of photographer I used to be, to help me figure out the photographer that I am today and the photographer that I want to become tomorrow. And I do believe that, especially with age, you learn to appreciate looking to yourself as a source of education, of learning, and of inspiration, as much as looking to external sources, other people, videos and all that stuff. So I thought it'd be fun. This is kind of the first of two videos of a small series that I wanted to put out. And in this one, I wanted to share with you 3 things that I used to do a bunch of back in the day that I'd never be caught doing today in Adobe Lightroom. If you look at my photos from, 2009, 2010, I think you'll find a particularly disturbing trend with the way that I would use Adobe Lightroom and some other products. Back then that was huge in the HDR heyday. It was starting to that star was rising with HDR. People were experimenting with it. Some people, like myself, experimented a bit too much, a bit too heavily, dragged some sliders further than they probably should have been dragged, but it's all good because I sit here a decade later and I am better for it. I'm able to look back and say, you know what, that's no bueno. That's not something that I want to do anymore to my photos. And it's not just like a knee-jerk thing. I genuinely understand because I went through that. I understand why I don't want to do it. Not that there's anything wrong with it. What I did back then, it's not a right or wrong. It's simply just knowing who you are as a photographer, knowing what your style is about. So what I'd like to do is jump over here to the computer, and I'm just going to talk to you about these three things that I used to do nonstop. And it's here's the thing. Some of it has to do with the way that I use tools. Some of it has to do with tools that never even existed back then. And some of it's just kind of poor choices. So let's jump over. But before we do, just start getting your thought process going, because I want to hear from you at the end of the video in the comments. I want to know if there are any kind of things you used to do back in the day that you probably don't do anymore. So we'll get to that in a bit. All right. So listen, I'm not saying that I'm proud of the photos that I used to take, but I do believe that by looking at this now, in fact, just preparing this video, it reminded me of a technique that I used to do back in the day, 2007, 2008, all the time. And yeah, I'm going to show it to you here, but again, that time 10 or 11 years ago, I was obsessed with HDR and I tone mapped everything. I mean, everything, whether it needed tone mapping or not. This photo does not need tone mapping, but I tone mapped it. And you might be wondering hey, wait, Brian, I don't get it. There's so many moving things. And how did you tone map? How'd you get your brackets if everything's moving, And back then de-ghosting was awful. And I was using Photomatics by a company called HDR Soft. This was well before Adobe put HDR in Lightroom and before iPhones had HDR. So you had to use the tools that were available. But the thing is, there's something to be said about knowing when to use the tools, even if the tools aren't the best. So let me show you what I did. So this is the photo. This is the final photo that I took, and it's pretty awful. It's absolutely awful. This is Starro Drive in Boston. There's the Charles River right over there. It's just not very good. So what I did, because I was so obsessed with HDR, is I would take a single photo and I would create 4 virtual copies. So the way that you can do that is you can press and hold Command apostrophe or Control apostrophe on Windows. 1, 2, 3, 4. You'll know that they're virtual copies because they have these little page curls in the bottom left corner of the thumbnail. And I do this. This is ridiculous. Just even thinking about it now it makes me laugh. I would actually simulate brackets. I would simulate taking a +1 and a +2 and a -1, -2. And I did it this way. So here, this would be my 0 bracket, my normal exposure. Then I'd go here to this one. I'd go under quick develop. And if you hover over under exposure, these 2 buttons, the ones that have the double left and right arrow, if you hover over them, it shows decrease exposure 1 stop and increase exposure 1 stop. So, right, here I'll go, okay, well, +1. Then I'll go here and I'll click this twice, and that's +2. And then here I'll go -1. And here I'll go -2. As if I was somehow magically conjuring up pixel information that wasn't there before. So I would then take them, I would send all 5 of these, I would export them out of Lightroom because, again, you couldn't do this in Lightroom yet. And I would tone map in Photomatics because Lightroom will export a virtual copy with whatever settings you apply to it. Fortunately, today, Lightroom saves you from yourself. So if I was Brian from 2007, 2008, trying to use Lightroom, this is Lightroom 8, Lightroom Classic version 8, and I tried to do that, watch what happens. So I'd right click, I'd go to Photo Merge, I'd go to HDR, and again, fortunately here you get an error message, unable to merge photos. One or more of the selected photos may lack metadata necessary for merging. And it's because Lightroom sees this is the exact same freaking photo. So it doesn't let you tone map it. You would have to actually export the files out, create individual files, and try to tone map it a different way. So, it's great. Like I said, it saves me from myself. I couldn't possibly do the tone map to get a result like this one here. Instead, I can go into this single file. Let's go ahead and we'll remove these virtual copies. Don't need them. We'll go into the actual image, and then, we can do things like, let's just see even what Auto does. Like, Auto does a pretty good job of giving me like an evenly exposed photo. And then I can manipulate different things. Like I can maybe open up the exposure a little bit, close a white point. I can use all kinds of things like a graduated filter if I wanted to, and just darken that just a tiny bit. And so the point is that back then, I was, like I said, tone mapping everything. I was creating HDR photos out of things that didn't need to. But there's still enough information here. I can tell that I can get some decent stuff going. I could play with the tone curve if I wanted to. And I can bring that information out without needing to do any sort of HDR tone mapping. And so that was one of the things that back in the day I did. And as I've gotten older and really kind of started learning about myself and what I used to do, I realized that I've actually grown quite a bit since then. All right, now let's go move on here to the second one. Oh my God. See, I tone mapped everything. And this is a photo. I took this at some abandoned car yard in Pennsylvania. I found it and I loved it. This was my jam back in the day. I loved it. I still do. If I saw something like this, I'd be all over it. But I bracketed it. You can see if you look at the sky, it's completely wrecked. And it's all a mess. And if if we go to the develop module, there's really not much here that we can do. And I'll show you kind of why or how I got this. The first thing the problem was my tone mapping. I don't have Photomatics anymore. I don't have a license for it, so I can't even show you what it was like to tone map. But often what I did after I tone mapped, and in that part, I also ruined. I jacked the sliders up. But in Lightroom, I'd go to, here, let's pretend this was a tone map photo. I'd go ahead and I'd jack up the contrast. I'd also increase clarity a ton. Let's open up those shadows. Just try to see if I can. I'm going to see if I can replicate the other photo. I boosted the vibrance. And let's open up the black point a little bit here. Actually, no, let's bring the black point down. Open the shadows. And then I'd also go to the sharpening. And without doing any sort of masking, I just jack up the sharpening. And so I get this super crispy photo. And add some more contrast there. Drop the highlights because for some reason I was afraid of having, near blown out highlights. I needed everything to be wrangled in. My point is that I didn't try to use the tools the correct way. I didn't use any sort of finesse. I just jack those sliders up. A lot of times what I would do actually is I would take the saturation slider, bring it to 0, vibrance to 100, and then just like bring saturation in like that. I mean, who does that? Who in their right mind would do that? It's just not something that for me would ever have a place in my workflow these days. So, if we reset here, what I've learned to do is one, I never admittedly used the histogram, and I probably didn't even know what a histogram was. So, I now understand how to read a histogram. I can see what's blown out and what's clipped. And I understand little things like pressing and holding the Option or Alt key. So Option on Mac, Alt on Windows, while dragging on, for instance, the highlight slider. Well, there I can see that area is where I have some blown out highlights. So if I just bring it over just a little bit, there I've recovered my highlights. Same thing with the shadows. Here I've got some shadows that are clipping. So if I bring the shadows and I open them up a little bit, that's fine. Same thing with the black point. And, there I go. And here I can continue to fiddle around until I get to a place where tone, as far as tone goes, it looks good. Then another thing that I never did was use the tone curve. I didn't even try to use the tone curve. If a preset that I had installed didn't use the tone curve, I would never use it. And if a preset applied something to the tone curve, I wouldn't question it. I just let it do what it had to do. But here, just a few weeks ago, I shared a video on how to use the tone curve using Adobe Lightroom. And so I can go and just kind of create my dots and open up the highlights a little bit and maybe add a little contrast, just a very subtle amount, as opposed to using the contrast slider, which, you can do. But I just don't like the contrast slider. I really don't use contrast very often. I almost always just use the tone curve to start adding some contrast. And, I can add a little bit of gray to the highlights if I wanted to, just to move the white point down and open the black point just a tiny bit. And now we have kind of this nice even image. And from here I can go and add a little bit of contrast, not jack it up, add a little bit of vibrance, go ahead, add some split toning. Another thing that I never really used because I didn't know what it did, but, pressing and holding the Option or Alt key while dragging on the hue slider will show me what the color value at 100% saturation would look like. So I can go somewhere here, like to my typical, let's do that post-apocalyptic thing where I go kind of green. So somewhere there, and bring that up somewhere right around there. And then complementary color, like a blue in the shadow. So add that and then bias it towards the greens a little bit. Let's jack that up even more. Something like that. Let's just see what that looks like. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So, like little things like that. And then, of course, go ahead with sharpening and press and hold the Option or Alt key. And actually what you want to do is, typically what I do is I'll take this little target tool and I'll put it over something that's supposed to be sharp like that. And then when I press and hold the Option or Alt key while dragging on a mount, I'll get that grayscale preview so I can see when I get overly sharp, which is right around there, things are getting a bit too crispy. So I back off. And then, of course, I've got masking, same thing, Option or Alt while dragging, get it to a place where all the flat surfaces are black. So we're removing sharpening from those flat areas. And we're good to go. And then maybe just a tiny bit of a vignette just to draw the eye towards the center of the frame. All right. So let's go here to grid and compare the two. Look at the difference. And that's all because of the different types of tools that I used. Where back then I used one set of tools the wrong way, didn't bother to really learn about it, and then learned about it, figured out what works for me, and then just applied it, in a way that's subtle, not necessarily something that has to beat you over the head like this photo here. Just look at this car here. You can see every little detail of that car. Why do you need to see every detail? Like for me, the fact that it kind of falls into shadow, that works. That works just fine because it brings the eye more towards the truck. Here, you don't know where to go. Where's your eye supposed to go? Because everything is exposed. Like there are no shadows. I crushed all the shadows. They're gone. So learning, how to properly guide the viewer and using the tools that are provided to you, I think is really important. It's a lesson that I'm very happy that I've learned. So the last one here is actually, it's not necessarily something that I used to do. Although if the tools were available back then, I can pretty much guarantee that I wouldn't use it because I wouldn't know. But there's also still just the pure thing that at some point back then, these tools weren't available and now they are. And so let's take this image here. I took this at the top of Mount Washington in New Hampshire, and we'll go to develop here. Now, let's say I want to do something with the sky. I don't know. Just I want to do something with it. I want to either darken the blues or something. So, sure, you can take a graduated filter here and maybe just kind of drop down, or I don't know, we can add some dehaze. But, I only really want to apply it to the blue and not anywhere else. Well, I mean, back then, either I just let it go because you can see it's applying everywhere within the filter. I mean, odds are I would probably let it go. I was not the kind of person who'd go into Photoshop and spend an hour masking out or using an adjustment brush and getting in between these things. These days now we have a range mask tool. And so I can go, for example, here and select color, which will allow me to actually just sample colors that I want to apply the effect to. So I can just go ahead here and draw a little selection on the blues, and I can shift and draw another one on this darker blue. And, just for good form, one more over here to really refine the mask. So if I go ahead and I want to further refine that, watch if I press and hold the Option or Alt key while dragging on a mount. See how we're refining that mask? Everything that's black is being hidden, but everything that's white, specifically the blue sky, that's where the effect will apply. And so now, let's say I go ahead here and I make things a little bit brighter. Only the blue is getting brighter or darker. Or if I want to add some saturation just to the blues, I can do that. And that's something that, one, again, if the tool existed back then, I probably wouldn't use it. But two, because it does exist today, it's important as a photographer to realize that, like, all right, these are the tools that are available to me, and I really should take the time to learn them, know how to apply them, and when to best kind of add them to a photo. So these are the things with like introspection. As I get older, I find myself really getting excited because I wonder in 10 years from now, what am I going to think of from the photos that I take today? So again, what I'd like for you guys to do, let me know if there are things that you used to do back in the day that you kind of regret or make you cringe. Leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. I definitely would. And if you like the video, I'd love that thumbs up. And if you want more of these videos, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell so you get notified when new ones come out. Aiming for a new video every single week. And yeah, so we're going to have a good time. I'll see you on the next one.